She hit the boy on the airplane, not even knowing whose son he was. Half an hour later, the plane landed, and everything changed. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The airport was quiet in the early hours before sunrise, the kind of silence that settles over wide, tiled floors and empty gates, where only the occasional voice echoes off the polished glass. Fluorescent lights bathed the terminal in a sterile glow as maintenance staff moved in slow, practiced patterns, sweeping, restocking, scanning. There was no rush yet, no announcements over the intercom, only the muffled roll of suitcases and the muted murmur of conversations far off in the distance. At gate 14B, a young boy sat alone near the window, his legs hanging slightly off the floor, his small frame dwarfed by the metallic bench. He wore a navy hoodie pulled up over his blonde hair, jeans that had seen one too many wash cycles, and spotless sneakers tied in double knots. Next to him on the seat rested a black backpack, the kind with only one strap, slung over the shoulder with ease by someone who had clearly learned to travel light. The boy's name was Caleb Norris, and he was 10 years old. He was not a child who fidgeted or swung his feet impatiently. Instead, he sat still, his back straight, a worn paperback open in his lap. The book was titled The Warrior's Path, Principles of Mind and Body, and though its pages were heavy with dense philosophy, he read it as though it were a bedtime story. There was a peaceful, focused air about him, not the stillness of fear, but the control of someone who had been taught to master discomfort. From a distance, he might have looked like any other unaccompanied minor, but a closer look revealed a different picture. There was no name tag hanging from his neck, no oversized security sticker, no visible sense of dependence. He had passed through security alone, accompanied only by an airport agent who had since returned to duty. Caleb had handled the check-in process with calm precision, handed over his documents without hesitation, answered questions in a voice steady and polite. Even the security officer had remarked with a smirk, "Kids more put together than half the adults I see at this hour." He didn't wear it on his sleeve, but there was discipline in his every movement. How he kept his hands clasped, how he turned pages without creasing the spine, how he scanned the terminal with slow, deliberate glances. It was the discipline of someone raised not only to defend himself, but to know when not to. The flight was scheduled to depart at 6:05 a.m., and boarding had just begun. When the gate attendant called for business class passengers, Caleb rose quietly, slipping his book into his backpack. He approached the boarding queue without pushing or looking around. The attendant took his ticket without surprise, scanned it, and with a routine smile, waved him forward. Nothing unusual was said. After all, his boarding pass clearly read Seat 3A Business Class. No one had any reason to question it, at least not yet. The jet bridge was cool, the air slightly damp with the scent of jet fuel. Caleb walked at a steady pace, unbothered by the hum of the engines or the sharp hiss of the hydraulic systems preparing the aircraft. When he entered the plane, he paused briefly, scanning the interior of the cabin with a single, comprehensive glance, then moved toward the front where rows of wider seats and extra legroom awaited. It wasn't his first time flying alone. In fact, it wasn't even his fifth. His father had taught him early how to be self-sufficient, how to carry himself with a quiet strength, how to be polite without being submissive. Caleb never called flight attendants miss or sir unless necessary. He thanked them, but he never tried to charm them. He followed instructions exactly, but never obsequiously. He had learned to occupy space without apologizing for it. When he reached row 3, he placed his backpack in the overhead bin without assistance, sat down by the window, and fastened his seatbelt. Then, with a quiet exhale, he opened his book again and resumed reading where he had left off. The business class section of Flight 214 was mostly empty still, with only a few passengers settled in. A man in a pressed gray suit scrolled through emails on his phone. A woman with curled hair and oversized sunglasses sipped from a travel mug. No one paid Caleb any attention. Or, if they did, they didn't let it show. But there was one person who noticed him immediately. From the galley near the cockpit, head flight attendant Margaret Hudson glanced down the aisle and saw the boy sitting alone in the 3A. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing together just enough to form a crease. She had been with the airline for over 20 years and had served in every section of the aircraft. She took pride in her professionalism, her attention to detail, her command of the cabin. To Margaret, order meant comfort, and comfort meant predictability. She watched Caleb for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the image disturbed her equilibrium. A child, alone in business class, no suit, no parent, no visible wealth, just a hoodie and a paperback book. It didn't fit. She said nothing yet. As more passengers boarded, Margaret moved through the cabin, assisting where needed, directing passengers, checking overhead bins. Her hands were efficient, her movements quick and authoritative. She nodded politely to businessmen, offered assistance to elderly travelers, and smiled tightly at younger adults. But each time she passed row 3, her eyes flicked towards the small figure by the window, her mind filing away details like a computer analyzing anomalies. The cabin eventually filled. The safety demonstration played. The engines roared to life. Caleb barely looked up. He had already memorized the layout of a Boeing 737, knew where every exit was, how the oxygen mask deployed, how long it took for the cabin lights to dim after takeoff. Instead, he kept reading, his fingers brushing the edge of the page in rhythm with the low rumble of acceleration. As the plane lifted off the ground, tilting gently toward the clouds, Caleb glanced out the window and watched the lights of the city vanish beneath a blanket of mist. Then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to breathe. 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out, just as his father had taught him. Control the breath, control the mind, control the mind, control the body. He didn't know yet that trouble was already watching him, not from above or below, but from across the aisle. Margaret Hudson, seated in the jump seat for takeoff, continued to stare, not openly, but with the trained subtlety of someone who had once worked surveillance detail on VIP flights. She wasn't suspicious in the way security agents were trained to be. Her suspicions came from something more visceral. A boy like that, sitting where he was sitting, reading what he was reading, dressed as he was dressed, it simply didn't align with her expectations. And for Margaret, expectations were everything. Once the seatbelt sign was turned off and the flight attendants began to move about the cabin, she stood, adjusted her uniform, and took a slow breath. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But she was certain of one thing. She would be paying that boy a visit. And from that moment, the air inside Flight 214 changed, imperceptibly to most, but to Caleb Norris, whose senses had been sharpened by training far older than his age, something now felt different. He closed his book, just slightly, enough to place a finger between the pages. And he waited. Caleb felt the shift before it fully arrived. It wasn't something he could see or hear, no raised voices, no dramatic gesture, but a tension in the air, A drop in temperature, like the room had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. He had been taught to notice changes like that, not to panic, just to be aware. He didn't lift his head when the footsteps approached. He turned the page slowly, kept his eyes fixed on the print, and prepared himself not for confrontation but for stillness. Stillness was power. Stillness was control. Margaret Hudson came to a stop beside his seat with the posture of someone who believed absolutely in the correctness of their presence. Her back was straight, her shoes pointed precisely forward, her uniform free of a single wrinkle. She held a clipboard in one hand and the faintest smirk on her lips, not amusement, but a look of private conclusion. Her eyes scanned Caleb from top to bottom, as though conducting an inventory. Hoodie, jeans, no adult, paperback book. Something didn't add up. "Good morning," she said, her voice polite but clipped, like a nurse trying to sound cheerful before delivering bad news. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Caleb looked up, his expression neutral. He had been expecting this moment since she first walked down the aisle. Without hesitation, he reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and withdrew the neatly folded paper. He handed it to her with both hands, just as his father had taught him. Clear, respectful, calm. She took it, not with grace, but with fingers that pinched like they were pulling something suspicious from a trap. Her eyes lowered to the paper, scanned it, then narrowed ever so slightly. "Seat 3A, business class." She read it aloud, slowly, as though it might change if she said it enough times. Caleb nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She looked down at him again. There was no gratitude in her face, no acknowledgement of his manners, only doubt. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am." Her head tilted slightly. That confirmed it. No visible parent, no suit, no explanation. She folded the boarding pass and handed it back, but didn't move away. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said. "This section is for business class passengers only. Are you sure this wasn't an upgrade? Sometimes we see mix-ups when people switch at the gate." Caleb returned the folded paper to his pocket. "No, ma'am. It was purchased that way." "Purchased?" she echoed. The word seemed to stick in her mouth. He nodded again. She offered a smile then, but it wasn't a real smile. It was the kind of smile that bared no teeth, the kind used when talking to children who might not understand what's coming next. "Well, I'll just need to check with the gate agents. In the meantime, why don't we have you move to the back of the aircraft so we can straighten things out without disrupting service here?" There was no actual need for him to move. There was no passenger missing their seat, no conflict in the seating chart, no emergency. The disruption she spoke of wasn't logistical. It was visual. A boy like Caleb, sitting alone in business class, dressed in plain clothes, reading a martial arts philosophy book. He didn't look the part. And Margaret didn't like when people didn't look the part. Caleb sat very still. His hands rested on the closed book in his lap. His voice was quiet but firm. "I'd prefer to stay in my seat, ma'am. That's the one that was purchased." Her face did not change, but something hardened behind her eyes. "Listen," she said, her voice dropping to something cool and flat. "I don't know how you got that ticket, but you're disrupting the environment in this cabin. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to notify the captain." The words came not with force, but with that bureaucratic chill that comes when power feels unquestionable. She had said them before, perhaps to other passengers who had challenged her authority, perhaps to crew members who had misstepped. The phrase, "notify the captain," was never a threat, it was a verdict. Caleb looked at her for a moment longer than before. His eyes were not frightened, not indignant. They were observant, assessing. Then he picked up his book, slid it into his backpack, and stood. As he did, a few heads turned. A man in a blue shirt glanced up from his laptop. A young woman looked over the edge of her seat. No one spoke. No one intervened. There was nothing visibly wrong, nothing scandalous. Just a boy being moved from a seat he had paid for because someone decided he didn't belong in it. Margaret guided him down the aisle, her steps quick, efficient. Caleb followed without dragging his feet, without looking around. He didn't ask questions. He didn't protest. He simply followed. They passed row after row of passengers, most too absorbed in their own routines to care, some watching with guarded curiosity. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet exchange of glances that said more than words ever could. At the back of the aircraft, Margaret stopped near a row just before the lavatories. "Have a seat here," she said. "We'll figure this out quickly and get you settled." Caleb didn't respond. He sat down, adjusted the seatbelt, and placed his backpack at his feet. The window beside him was smaller here, the seat narrower, the armrests thinner. The roar of the engines was louder, the vibration more noticeable. But what struck him most was how much less space there was to simply be. Margaret walked away, her posture unshaken. To her, this was a correction, an adjustment. She had placed something back where it belonged. She returned to the business class cabin, ready to resume service, confident that order had been restored. Back in row 31, Caleb sat quietly. He opened his backpack and pulled out his book again. He didn't open it this time. He rested it on his lap. His fingers were still. His breathing remained slow, but his eyes were on the phone now, resting face down beside him on the tray. A passenger across the aisle glanced at him briefly, then away. A woman near the front looked back once, then focused again on her magazine. No one said anything, and Caleb waited. The minutes passed slowly. Then he picked up the phone. He tapped the screen once to wake it. Then he opened a contact. It had no name, just a single character. He held the phone to his chest for a second, as if bracing for the sound. But he knew there would be none. There didn't need to be. He tapped the call button. The signal blinked. A moment later, it connected. Caleb spoke only 3 words. "Dad, it happened." And then he ended the call. There was no flare of emotion, no tears, no rush of adrenaline. He placed the phone back on the tray, turned his head towards the small oval window, and watched the clouds passing beside the wing. Stillness was power. He had done what he needed to do. Now he would wait. The cabin of Flight 214 had settled into that familiar rhythm that usually came after takeoff and the initial flurry of activity. Flight attendants moved with efficient grace, distributing drinks and meals, responding to call buttons, whispering into radios. Business class had returned to its insulated bubble, and the economy section had begun its slow descent into quiet boredom and soft snoring. Yet, at the far rear of the plane, just before the lavatories, something different pulsed beneath the surface of calm. Caleb sat in seat 31A, the very last window seat, squeezed between the vibrating fuselage and a snoring businessman who hadn't even registered his presence. The air smelled different here, like reused oxygen and old coffee, tinged with something faintly metallic. The seats were narrower, the recline limited, and the hum of the engines far more invasive. But Caleb made no complaint. His backpack was neatly at his feet, his book untouched on his lap. His fingers, however, rested lightly on the edge of his phone. He had made the call exactly 6 minutes ago, short, controlled, to the point, and now he waited. He did not wait like a child hoping to be rescued. He waited the way a chess player waits for a move to reach the board, knowing the piece already in motion was more powerful than anything he could say out loud. He watched the soft turbulence ripple across the drink in the cup beside him. He noticed how the sound of conversation dimmed slightly as a crew member passed through with a cart. He observed the woman 2 rows ahead, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her head occasionally turning toward him with half curiosity and half denial. Margaret Hudson had returned to the front. She had resumed her duties with a practiced smile and brisk efficiency, but there was a visible tension in the way her shoulders sat. Something about the situation didn't sit right, and the boy's passivity irked her more than she expected. Most children cried or protested. Most made a scene that justified her correction. This one, with his silent eyes and military posture, had neither begged nor questioned. That unsettled her in a way she couldn't articulate. She tried to dismiss it as defiance, tried to tell herself that he was just a precocious, spoiled brat too clever for his own good. But she kept glancing toward the rear of the cabin, where she could see the edge of his blond head between the seat backs. Her irritation sharpened. 20 minutes had passed since she moved him. She decided it was time to check on him again. Margaret walked to the rear with purpose, her heels quiet on the carpet, her hands behind her back. She didn't smile as she approached him. Instead, she stood directly in the aisle beside his row, her presence filling the space like a shadow. "Young man," she said, her voice too loud for the volume of the cabin, "I told you to wait here while we sorted things out. Why are you still using that phone?" Caleb looked up. He had not been using the phone. It was lying face down on the tray table. His hands had been resting in his lap, unmoving. "I wasn't," he said plainly. Margaret's lips tightened. She stepped forward abruptly and reached across the tray, snatching the phone without warning. "You don't need to be contacting anyone right now," she said. The man beside Caleb stirred slightly in his sleep, but said nothing. A young woman in the row across looked over and then quickly away. Caleb sat still. Then he reached toward the phone, not to take it back, but to lay a hand beside it, indicating silently that it was not hers to keep. "Please, don't touch my things," he said softly. Something in his tone, calm, level, free of fear, enraged her in a way that caught even Margaret off guard. She was used to commanding obedience. She was used to raised voices, to groveling apologies, to tearful excuses. But this quiet presence, this self-possession in a boy who looked barely 10, it unnerved her. And then, without thinking, she acted. Her hand snapped out and slapped his hand away from the tray. The sound was sharp, small, but it echoed in the metal cabin like a struck bell. Several passengers turned. One gasped. The man beside Caleb stirred but didn't open his eyes. The young woman across the aisle covered her mouth. No one spoke. Margaret stood there, her breath short, her hand frozen mid-air for a half-second too long. Caleb blinked once. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He slowly retracted his hand, letting it rest in his lap again. The skin on the back of it flushed slightly red, but he made no move to tend to it. "I said," Margaret hissed, suddenly aware of the attention, "you will sit here and wait until we decide what to do with you." Still, he said nothing. He did not even look at her. His gaze had returned to the window, where the clouds drifted softly past in endless white rows. His body did not shrink. He did not recoil into the seat. He remained straight-backed and composed, like a soldier on parade. Margaret turned sharply and walked away. The heat in her face felt like boiling water. She told herself it had been an accident, A reflex, a necessary assertion of order. But deep down, beneath the walls of habit and protocol, she knew something inside her had snapped. And not just because of the boy, because of what he represented, stillness in the face of her authority. She returned to the galley, filled a paper cup with lukewarm coffee, and took a deep breath. At the back of the plane, Caleb lifted the phone again. Slowly, deliberately. He typed only a single sentence. She slapped my hand and took the phone. "I'm in the last row." He hit send, and then, once again, he waited. He was not waiting for justice. Not yet. Justice was too large, too slow. He was waiting for precision, and he knew that, on the other end of that message, precision had already begun to move. 23 rows ahead, a man in a navy suit readjusted his posture in business class. A woman by the window looked out, saw nothing but clouds, and returned to her crossword. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Caleb sat still. His hand throbbed faintly, a dull ache spreading up the forearm. He ignored it. He closed his eyes. 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out. His father had taught him that control is not measured in what you do to others, but in what you refuse to let others do to you. And Caleb, in that moment, refused to be broken. The slap echoed long after the sound had faded. Not in the physical sense. It had not been loud, not disruptive enough to call for immediate confrontation, but in the quieter, heavier weight it left hanging in the space around seat 31A. Caleb didn't move. His hand had begun to sting, a dull redness forming on the skin, but he didn't look at it. He didn't touch it. He kept his gaze turned toward the window, watching the unchanging horizon with eyes that saw far more than the sky. The phone rested silently in his lap. No reply had arrived. Not yet. But he knew what he had done. He had pressed the correct number, said the correct words. He hadn't needed to explain. That was never required with his father. His father didn't ask follow-up questions when the world made its cruelty plain. He acted. And now the clock had started. In the cockpit at the front of the plane, Captain Stuart Mendez was reviewing flight data on the control panel. A 32-year veteran of commercial aviation, Mendez had flown through storms, emergency landings, and engine failures. He had seen it all. His hands moved over switches with the practiced rhythm of someone who no longer had to think. But when the message arrived through the encrypted crew alert system, one that bypassed normal air traffic control and was used only in the rarest of emergencies, his hand froze mid-air. His first officer looked up, confused. "What is it?" she asked. Mendez said nothing. His eyes scanned the brief, high-priority transmission. The screen showed just one line of instruction. Flight 214, return to point of origin. No delay. Full cooperation required. Code Norris 1. His stomach tightened. Norris 1 was a name only a handful of commercial captains ever heard during their careers. It was not an emergency protocol. It was a directive, high-level, immediate, and absolutely non-negotiable. It meant the owner of that name had just issued a command. Mendez reached for the cabin phone. His voice, when it came, was steady but cold. "Get me the lead flight attendant. Now." Margaret Hudson was leaning against the galley counter, sipping from a paper cup of burnt coffee. The bitterness was welcome. It gave her something else to focus on. She wasn't thinking about the boy's hand. Not directly. But it played in her mind, nonetheless, a loop with no resolution. The way he had looked at her, not accusingly, not even surprised, just unflinching. She had meant to remind him of his place, But in that moment, she had only exposed hers. The call came over the intercom. She stiffened. "Margaret, to cockpit." The words sent a strange chill through her spine. It wasn't a routine check. Pilots didn't summon cabin crew during cruise without cause, and they didn't use that tone unless something had gone wrong. She smoothed her skirt, tossed the cup, and walked forward, her heels nearly silent on the carpet. The other attendants watched her pass, their expressions unreadable. There was a weight in the air now, something spreading slowly but certainly. When she reached the cockpit, Captain Mendez was standing just outside the doorway, arms folded. "Inside," he said. She stepped in. The first officer stood up and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was soft but final. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice composed. Mendez didn't respond immediately. He turned the small cabin monitor toward her. The message was still on screen. She read it twice before understanding registered. Her lips parted slightly. "Is that—" "Yes," Mendez said. "It's real. It came through the Norris channel." She blinked. "But why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the intercom again. "Ground control. This is Flight 214. Request an immediate return to Los Angeles. No emergency declared. High priority protocol active. Confirm runway clearance." The reply came swiftly. "Cleared to return. Tower has been notified. Maintain current altitude until instructed. Priority granted." Mendez turned back to Margaret. "We're going back. And until we land, I want you to treat every seat and every passenger like they are being watched by a courtroom. Is that clear?" She nodded slowly, color draining from her face. Then the realization hit. "It's the boy, isn't it?" He didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. The name alone was enough. She backed out of the cockpit like a woman trying to avoid a slip near a ledge. The corridor outside seemed longer than before, the cabin lights brighter, too honest. Passengers were murmuring now. The pilot had made no announcement yet, but people sensed something. A disruption of routine in the sky is never subtle. Whispers were starting to travel from row to row. Some wondered if it was weather, others mechanical failure. But there were no tremors in the wings, no unusual sounds, no flickering lights. Just a change in course. Caleb didn't look up when the plane began its slow, imperceptible arc back toward California. But he knew. He had felt the shift in the engine's tone, the subtle drop in angle. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and placed the phone back in his backpack. 20 minutes later, Captain Mendez made the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a situation that requires immediate review on the ground, we will be returning to our point of origin. This is not an emergency. I repeat, not an emergency. Your safety is not at risk. We ask for your cooperation and calm while we adjust our route." There was silence for a moment, then the low murmur began again, this time more urgent. A woman in 4C leaned into the aisle. A man reached for his laptop and began closing files. Someone unbuckled early and was told to sit down again. Margaret stood frozen at the galley for several seconds before walking slowly toward the back. Her hands were no longer steady. She passed through the cabin like a ghost, barely registering the glances now beginning to follow her. Caleb was still in seat 31A. His posture had not changed. When she reached his row, she stopped, her shadow falling over him. He turned his head just slightly, acknowledging her presence. "I need you to come with me," she said quietly. He looked at her, then stood without a word. As they walked together up the aisle, the cabin quieted. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone understood one thing. This boy, who had walked to the back in silence, was now returning to the front. Not because he demanded it, not because he made a scene, but because someone powerful, had spoken on his behalf, and no one dared ignore that voice. Caleb was shown back to seat 3A, the same one he had been removed from. It was still empty. The seatbelt hung loosely over the armrest like it had been waiting. He sat. No one spoke. Margaret hovered for a moment, unsure what to say. Then she turned and walked away, back down the aisle, each step louder than the last. In the cockpit, Captain Mendez confirmed touchdown with the tower. A private vehicle was waiting at the gate. Instructions had been issued to remove no passengers except by name. One name, no press, no delay. Flight 214 would resume its course an hour later, but when it landed in Texas, it would be a different flight, because on that day, silence had broken midair, and the boy in seat 3A had never raised his voice. The descent back into Los Angeles was quiet, deliberate, and solemn. There was no turbulence, no emergency lights, no panic in the air. And yet the cabin felt heavier than it had on departure, as though gravity itself had thickened. Every passenger on board, Flight 214, sensed something had shifted. Something they hadn't been told. Something that had traveled silently from the back of the plane to the cockpit and changed the direction of the entire journey. Caleb sat once again in seat 3A, the same seat he had boarded with over an hour earlier. He did not glance around to gauge reactions, nor did he allow himself the satisfaction of vindication. He simply sat as he had sat before, calm, upright, hands folded in his lap. The only difference now was the weight in the air around him and the silence that was no longer neutral, but loaded with recognition. The woman across the aisle who had ignored him earlier now sat with her phone face down in her lap. She hadn't looked at him directly since he passed her on the way back, but she hadn't looked away either. The man in the seat behind her sat perfectly still, elbows off the armrest, posture attentive like a student called upon without warning. The businessman who had once whispered a complaint about the drink selection now stirred his coffee without sipping it. No one had said a word to Caleb, but everyone had seen. The aircraft touched down at a slightly shallower angle than usual, smooth and practiced. As the wheels kissed the runway, a faint exhale seemed to pass through the cabin. Not relief, not closure, only anticipation of what came next. Captain Mendez did not speak again. He had done what was required. Now he waited like everyone else. The plane taxied slowly to a remote gate far from the main terminals. This was not a usual arrival point for domestic flights. The tarmac was empty except for one sleek black vehicle waiting on the service road and 3 figures standing by the portable staircase that had been rolled to the plane's door. 2 wore dark suits. 1 wore a sharply pressed military uniform with no name badge, only insignia. Margaret Hudson had been called to the galley moments before landing. A flight operations representative had boarded in secret through the rear, handed her a sealed envelope, and departed without a word. The envelope was thin, formal, and carried the embossed crest of the airline's executive board. She had not opened it until now. She held it in both hands as if expecting it to burn. The passengers were told to remain seated. The seatbelt sign remained on, but the flight attendants didn't begin the usual final routines. No one opened overhead bins. No one prepared to disembark. Instead, the forward door opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and 2 of the figures from the tarmac stepped on board. They did not smile. They did not speak. They walked directly to seat 3A. "Caleb Norris?" one of them said, his voice low and measured. Caleb looked up and nodded. The man crouched slightly to meet him at eye level, not like a police officer, not like a principal, but like someone who knew precisely who the boy was. "Your father's message has been received. We're here to escort you to a secure location for further briefing. Do you require anything at this time?" Caleb shook his head once. "I'm ready," he said. The man nodded and straightened. Then, in a gesture that was more formal than necessary, he stepped back and motioned toward the exit. Caleb rose. He did not look back. He did not check for his bag. It had already been retrieved. He walked the length of the aisle for the second time that morning, but this time his steps were not heavy with injustice. They were purposeful, measured, like footsteps placed deliberately in snow where others would be able to follow. As he passed, the cabin remained silent. Some passengers shifted slightly. A woman in her 20s touched her chest. A man near the back cleared his throat and said nothing. One or two tilted their heads as if they wanted to say something, perhaps even apologize, but no words came. None seemed adequate. He stepped out of the aircraft and into the bright morning sun. The vehicle door opened before he reached it. He climbed in without needing help. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality. Inside the plane, the remaining passengers sat in silence. No one reached for a bag. No one asked if they could leave. Margaret Hudson was summoned to the cockpit again. This time she did not walk with her usual pace. Captain Mendez waited, his arms folded behind his back. He had aged in the last hour, not in years, but in presence. He had been flying long enough to know the difference between turbulence in the sky and turbulence in a system. This, he understood, was the latter. "He's gone," she said quietly. Mendez didn't respond. He turned toward the small console screen and read aloud what he had just received. "Passenger 3A is the son of Charles Norris." Margaret swallowed hard. Mendez looked up. "Do you know what that means?" She nodded, though the reality of it still hadn't fully landed. "He doesn't make phone calls," Mendez continued. "He issues orders. You weren't corrected by a father. You were corrected by a man who has authority over the very system you thought you controlled." She didn't answer. Her throat had gone dry. He paused for a long moment, then handed her the envelope she had received. "You should open that now." Her hands shook as she tore the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not on company letterhead, but something higher. A directive from the airline's Internal Oversight Division. It stated plainly that she was being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. An internal review would be launched. The language was calm, impersonal, but devastating. She stood motionless for a long time. When she finally turned to leave the cockpit, her steps were no longer firm. They were deliberate, but without confidence. Every row she passed felt like a memory she hadn't meant to create. Every glance from passengers reminded her of a moment she could no longer undo. She returned to the galley at the rear and sat on the small fold-down jump seat. Her hands clasped between her knees, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the cabin wall. A voice spoke from behind her. It was one of the junior attendants. "Do you want us to begin the deboarding procedures?" Margaret did not respond at first. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, almost inaudibly. Passengers began to stand, one row at a time. Bags came down from compartments. Quiet apologies were exchanged not for bumping elbows, but for what had remained unsaid. The plane emptied gradually, not with the usual urgency, but with the quiet of a room that had borne witness to something it didn't quite understand, but would not forget. Outside, the black vehicle carrying Caleb moved across the tarmac toward a private terminal. Inside, he sat facing forward, his seatbelt fastened, his expression unchanged. He did not look back toward the plane. He had done nothing except claim the seat he had paid for. He had said nothing except the truth. And the world around him had shifted. He reached into his backpack and took out his book. He opened to the page he had marked and placed his finger beneath the line he had last read. But he didn't read. Not yet. Instead, he stared at the words without seeing them, listening to the echo of quiet things, the wheels on the runway, the soft thrum of the engine, and the memory of a slap that had landed not just on skin, but across an entire system that had assumed it would never be questioned. Caleb closed the book again. He would read later. For now, he simply sat and waited. Flight 214 departed again just under an hour after it had returned to Los Angeles. The sky outside had not changed. The same slate-blue horizon stretched beyond the clouds, indifferent to human misjudgment. But inside the aircraft, everything was different. The seat that Caleb had occupied, 3A, was empty again, but it no longer looked like a seat on a commercial flight. It looked like something preserved, something set apart, something marked by absence. No one dared ask for it. No one leaned across it. It had become, without ceremony, a symbol. The passengers had reboarded without conversation. They moved slowly, in sequence, speaking in lowered voices or not at all. Even the flight attendants, now one short, performed their duties with a quiet restraint. The rituals of air travel, safety demonstrations, drink service, polite chatter, proceeded, but with an altered rhythm, like a melody missing certain notes. In the rear galley, Margaret Hudson was no longer present. She had been quietly removed from the flight before departure resumed. No announcement was made, and no one asked where she had gone. Her name wasn't spoken, not even by the junior crew, who now wore expressions not of relief or glee, but of quiet reckoning. Authority had shifted, not because it had been taken by force, but because it had been seen too clearly. The silence on board was not oppressive, it was reflective. People sat with their hands folded or rested on tray tables, looking not at phones or screens, but at the walls, the windows, the stitching on seat backs. Some stared at the clouds, others at nothing. A businessman in row 5 reread the same paragraph of his report 3 times before closing it and placing it in the seat pocket. A woman in 6C held her travel journal open but didn't write. No one wanted to be the first to speak aloud what had happened, and yet they all understood. In the flight log, seat 3A was listed as unoccupied for the remainder of the journey. The captain, who had not left the cockpit since the plane was cleared to take off again, glanced back at the notation twice, though there was nothing to change. The name attached to that seat remained the same, Caleb Norris, but Caleb was no longer on board, and the seat he had claimed, been removed from and reclaimed again before vanishing silently into a black vehicle at the edge of the tarmac, had become, in every unspoken sense, occupied still. Passengers found themselves remembering the small things now, how he had walked past them with his backpack slung over one shoulder, how he hadn't spoken to anyone, how he had neither demanded nor complained, but had simply existed where he had a right to be, and had been punished for it. The slap, which not everyone had seen, had been felt in waves. It had not drawn a scream or an outcry. It had not made the flight lurch or stop in mid-air, but its presence lingered now in the spaces between glances, in the tightness behind people's jaws, in the quiet rubbing of a thumb against a palm. The guilt that began to build was not directed at Margaret. It wasn't simple enough for that. She had been the hand, yes, but the silence had been theirs. It was not just that no one had stood up when Caleb was removed from his seat. It was that no one had even asked a question. They had let it happen. And now that same silence pressed on them from the inside out. Row by row, the plane moved through the air with the slow, unwavering determination of something larger than machinery. It had become a vessel not just of passengers, but of consequence. People did not discuss business or make connections. They reviewed themselves. A man near the rear pulled his blanket tighter and stared at the seatbelt sign as if hoping it would distract him. A young woman pulled out her phone to text, then changed her mind and placed it screen down beside her. A teenage boy stared at the seat where Caleb had once sat, then lowered his head, ashamed of nothing he had done, only of what he hadn't. Even the crew, trained in the art of service without reflection, had begun to speak in shorter sentences. The new lead attendant, a woman named Jessica who had served under Margaret for 2 years, performed her duties with clarity, but not confidence. She asked passengers if they needed water, but never lingered. She moved briskly, mechanically. Her face was tight. It wasn't fear that gripped her. It was awareness. Jessica had witnessed Margaret's approach to order for years. She had excused it more times than she could count. It was the system, she had told herself. It was how things worked. But now, as she stood in the aisle and looked at the empty seat in business class, she felt her hands tremble. She had seen the boy removed. She had felt the shift in the air when it happened. And she had said nothing. Not because she agreed, but because she had trained herself not to interfere. Now she couldn't stop remembering the boy's face. Not angry, not broken, just waiting, quiet and still like a mirror turned outward. As she passed row 5 again, a man in a gray blazer stopped her. "Was he really?" he asked, his voice low. Jessica paused. "He was," she said. "His father. He owns the controlling stake in the airline." The man let out a breath and nodded, looking away. But that wasn't the part that mattered anymore. The importance hadn't been in who the boy's father was. It was in how everyone had waited to know that before they decided how to feel. The shame that had begun to coil itself around each passenger came not from guilt about the slap, but from the silence that had followed it. In seat 7D, a woman who had once tutted under her breath when Caleb boarded now wrote quietly in the Notes app on her phone, "I watched him walk by." I said nothing. I knew it was wrong. I didn't even meet his eyes. She closed the app without saving. Across the aisle, another man, middle-aged, conservative suit, sharp haircut, stared at the overhead bin above seat 3A. He wasn't sure why. It was closed. It had been empty since Caleb's bag was removed, but he kept staring, his fingers twitching in his lap. The more the flight progressed, the more silence itself became something sacred. A penitent hush, born not of fear, but of confrontation with the mirror that boy had carried with him. Not a literal one, something deeper, something everyone had seen without wanting to admit. It wasn't just about one child being told to move. It was about what that revealed in the people who watched. In the cockpit, Captain Mendez remained focused. He had received another message after takeoff. It was brief and written in the clipped language of executive authority. No further action required. The boy is safe. Continue route as scheduled. But there had also been a second line. Your composure is noted. He didn't smile. He wasn't proud. He felt, above all else, tired, because he too had watched the boy be moved. And he too had said nothing. Not until the protocol came through. Not until it became about power, authority. He had done his job, but he had not done it early enough. Now he knew it. In the back rows, a mother leaned down to her young daughter and whispered in her ear. The girl nodded, then asked in a voice too loud for the moment, "Why didn't anyone help him?" The mother shushed her gently, then answered with something quiet that no one else could hear. But the girl's words remained. They hung in the air like an indictment not shouted but whispered in truth. Why didn't anyone help him? No one had a good answer. As the plane continued across the country, every minute carried not just the aircraft but the passengers within it toward something uncomfortable and necessary. By the time Flight 214 began its descent into Austin, the cabin had changed again. People sat with better posture. They waited longer before unbuckling. They didn't jostle for the aisle or crowd the doors, and when the wheels finally touched down, there was no applause. Only the soft click of lives adjusting themselves, one quiet breath at a time. The landing of Flight 214 was smooth, almost unnaturally so, as if the aircraft itself had learned restraint during its journey. The wheels met the tarmac with a hush rather than a thump, and the long, controlled deceleration made it feel as though the plane were exhaling rather than braking. The cabin remained still in the moments following touchdown, as if every soul on board knew that the end of the flight was not the end of what had been set in motion. Seatbelt signs stayed lit longer than usual. The captain made no immediate announcement. Flight attendants stood poised but silent. Passengers, normally eager to leap to their feet and claim overhead space before the aircraft even reached the gate, remained seated. Bags stayed in bins, heads remained bowed. Conversations, if any, were little more than breath shared between companions. A few glanced at seat 3A, still empty, still sacred. None dared occupy it. The plane pulled into its designated gate slowly, almost ceremoniously. On the other side of the reinforced door, a small group waited. Not reporters, not executives, but internal personnel and 2 representatives from airline corporate relations. They held no signs. They carried no microphones. They had come not to explain, but to listen. Jessica, the acting lead attendant, received the instruction through her headset a moment before the seatbelt sign dimmed. She acknowledged with a single word, then turned to the cabin, her voice clear but softened by something new: humility. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience and cooperation throughout this flight. We ask that you remain seated for just a few additional moments while a special boarding team enters. Afterward, you'll be invited to disembark as usual. She paused, and for a second her lips parted again as if she wanted to say more. But then she nodded slightly to herself and set the intercom back in place. Her eyes lingered briefly on 3A, and she said nothing else. The passengers obeyed, not because they had to, but because something inside them asked them to. When the doors opened and the representatives stepped into the cabin, there was no fanfare. Just the sound of polished shoes on the rubber matting, and a brief hush that swept forward and back like a breeze. The 2 figures, a man in a black suit and a woman in a gray blazer, walked only a few steps before pausing beside 3A. The man spoke first. "We understand that the passenger assigned to this seat is no longer on board," he said. His voice was not loud, but every ear heard him. "We are here on behalf of the airline's executive board. We would like to make a brief address before disembarkation." There was no protest. The passengers waited. The woman stepped forward. What occurred earlier today was not simply a personnel matter. It was a moment in which this airline failed to uphold the dignity and basic decency owed to every passenger. We will be conducting an independent internal review. But before any official statements or policies, we came here for one reason. She looked around the cabin slowly, making deliberate eye contact with several passengers. To acknowledge, face to face, that what happened to the boy seated here was wrong, and not wrong because of who his father is, but because of what should never happen to any child or any person on any flight ever. The silence that followed was thick, not with resistance, but with the collective recognition of truth. The man stepped beside her again. If anyone feels they witnessed something today they want to speak about, there will be a private space near Gate 9 with our compliance officers present. You will not be recorded. You will not be required to give your name. But we encourage your honesty. We are not here to protect ourselves. We are here to understand how we failed. With that, he nodded to Jessica, who opened the forward curtain. One by one, the passengers began to rise. There was no rush to the aisle. Instead, each movement was measured. People retrieved bags gently, waited for those ahead to move, and offered space. A middle-aged man in a window seat paused before stepping into the aisle, his hand resting on the top of the seat 3A for a moment, not as a gesture of claim, but of acknowledgement. He bowed his head slightly, then moved on. A young woman in a loose sweater lingered behind the others. She had watched Caleb from afar since boarding, and now, standing near his former seat, she allowed herself a moment to remember not just his presence, but her absence in his defense. She traced her thumb along the seam of the seat back, then whispered a phrase no one else heard. "I should have said something." Then she walked away. Farther back in the cabin, a father and his son approached. The boy, no older than 8, looked up at his dad. "Why did they say sorry?" he asked in a voice that pierced the hush. The father knelt beside him. "Because they were quiet when they should have spoken," he replied. "And now they're trying to do better." The boy nodded solemnly. "Like superheroes?" "No," the man said, "like people." Caleb, long gone from the aircraft, sat now in a room with no windows, no fanfare. The room was quiet. A bottle of water had been placed before him. A plain folder sat unopened on the table. Across from him sat no one. This was not an interrogation. There were no lights aimed at his face, no barrage of questions, just a waiting room for the world to catch up with what had happened. He did not fidget. He did not ask the time. He simply sat as he had on the plane, back straight, hands folded on the table. He knew his father would come when it was time, and until then he was content to let others move. The door opened at last, not loudly, but with the firm precision of someone who didn't have to announce himself. Charles Norris stepped inside. He wore no tie, no badge of rank, just a dark jacket and the kind of stillness that came not from fear, but from history. His face was unreadable. Caleb looked up. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, nothing else happened. Then Charles walked to the other side of the table, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and squeezed it gently. "You handled it," he said. Caleb nodded. "Did I do the right thing?" "You did the necessary thing." They said nothing else for a while. Outside, the world had already begun adjusting itself. Policies were being rewritten. Internal systems flagged for audit. Training modules modified. But the more important shift had occurred in the cabin of Flight 214, among ordinary people who had once thought silence was neutrality, and who now understood it for what it was: consent. They had not stood when they should have. They had not spoken when a voice was needed, but some had felt it. Some had watched the boy walk to the back and knew it was wrong. Some had watched him walk back up again and felt a crack inside themselves that couldn't be ignored, and that was enough to begin something new. Not because the world had changed, but because one boy, seated in silence, had made them see the world they were in. When Caleb and his father left the building later that evening, they did not exit into lights or cameras. No reporters waited outside. No photographers snapped photos. Only the sky greeted them, vast and blue, as they stepped together into the quiet of the parking lot. And from somewhere in the distance, a plane lifted into the air, following a flight path charted not just by coordinates, but by conscience. Caleb looked up. His father followed his gaze. Neither spoke. There was no need. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be seen. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our other videos and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.